coming into to scope and change management.
Yes, it is important on the scope side that you really start your scope during the front-end loading. That's that preparation phase and your pre-feasibility and your feasibility and your planning. If you've done that well, your implementation portion is actually the easy one. You go through the stages of understanding your charter, your initial assessment, it's the facility scope, your initial capital, but then you develop your plan and finally develop your scope. And your scope needs to be safe and it will work and it will not change. But then when you're in the scope phase, when manage the scope is the rigorous change control. So that, and you need to implement your agreed scope. If you want to change your scope at that stage, you're going to really have problems. Okay, next slide. Here we're talking about your variances and what happens. And very often, basically, as variances come up and what you see is your customer is asking for things and you're only implementing, not really actioning it correctly. And then your customers will just do what they want to do. So in this case, the contractor will just basically do it. But what type of changes you normally have? It's your owner changes, it's your real scope changes, it's your add-ons, your scope grows, and your operational guys come with operational requirements. But you want to limit those things because that could run away with it. The thing that's always difficult is your site issues. If you discover new site conditions, somebody changed regulations and you have to do changes there. But when your contractor changes, contract designs of equipment and the subcontractors, these changes could be mutual, and it's always better if it's a mutual agreement, but then also unilateral from one side to somebody vary the contract. You find if your contractor running in problems, he tries to do that, but then the other party will normally have a right to cease the relationship, but you're in a very difficult spot at that stage. And then bilateral decisions to vary the contract and the variation control. But the real key issue is here, you don't really want to get into this phase and allowing changes. You must try and prevent that. Your upfront design and quality feasibility and your feed is important. But when you get to a potential change, it's important that you need to analyze that, you cost it, you really need to determine all the impact and understand what's the business impact. Do you really get something out of it? And only at that stage would you want to approve that. Okay, move on. How do you do your effective change management? So you need to set up a regular review and approval meetings, and regular it's normally weekly required. And then you have to, this group must be empowered to make decisions, and the change request must be submitted well before the meeting, that people can actually go through it and make sure that they know how to decide what to do. The meeting must make the decision because they're empowered to do this decision and that you can move on. Otherwise, people will wait on site and don't know what to do. But if you can't make the decision, the meeting still must make a firm recommendation and make sure that you get your approval very quickly. You need to look at, is this a scope within the contract or is it actually a change of the scope? Because if it's within the contractor must actually just make a plan and implement that. But if it's actually a real contract change of scope, it needs to have a much higher impact. All of this needs to be recorded in your various documents. Otherwise, at the end, you will not know what's going on and how do you manage your final cost. You're going to get into contractual problems, and it needs to be communicated to everybody in your project. And on the right-hand side, it's just a very simple way of looking at that. You basically, the description of the change, why you're doing it, and then the impact that assists you with making that decision. Thank you.
All right, so I'm gonna do basically the same thing. Give an example of what would be like a construction change or an error and omission type change versus an owner change. So This is a building that we built a couple of years ago, and it has a mansard roof where the roof cantilevers out about 8 feet from the face of the building. And as we're building this building, we bought prefabricated trusses. So we had about 1,000 of these trusses that had to be installed, and then they had to be cribbed together to attach each individual truss laterally to the other trusses. And all was well and good until we got in the lower left-hand corner, we're putting these metal panels up under the soffit, and it's supposed to be a 90-degree angle between them and the brick wall. And what we found, it was less than 90 degrees, which meant that the trusses somehow were failing. And on the right-hand side, we hadn't even loaded it with the complete weight of the final system. So this was a problem. We went to the truss fabricator, and to summarize their response, it's like, yeah, maybe something's going wrong, maybe something's not, we don't know, we don't see any evidence of that. So obviously there's a problem, but nobody's willing to take ownership of that. Now, what we found out was actually happening is this is the top cord of the truss is sagging a little bit as it goes out past the edge of the building. And so in the lower left, we actually had to add an extra stud along the top. So for 1,000 of these, and you had to climb in under the roofing because it was already done. And in order to get it straight, we had to put scaffolding around the whole building to jack the truss up so it was straight. So in my typical projects, this would have been an error, an omission, a design issue. Nothing would have happened until we figured out whose fault it was. In this case, it was clear this is not an owner scope change. So this is a design and construction issue. There's no change order for this. The team very quickly came up with a solution. Although it was costly, they quickly came up with a solution and they implemented it. And financially, it cost about $250,000 to fix the issue. $40,000 was covered from the lump sum trust provider. $210,000 is what the team had to spend to fix this issue. Now, because of the shared savings plan, they lost $70,000 in bonus that they would have got. So the owner, we ended up paying $140,000 to resolve this issue. But most importantly, we didn't lose any time. I think in a traditional agreement, we would have lost several months arguing about this issue before it got fixed. And when it's your roof right before winter, that delays the entire job. So I wanted to say, in the IRPD environment, the only changes that we really have are either discovered site conditions, so underground, which usually we're pretty good at managing, authority having jurisdiction, so if the code changes, but usually we know about that ahead of time. So the real things that we're managing are where we're actually adding scope to the job. And healthcare projects take a long time, and the equipment and the procedures are always changing. So change is pretty much a given in our business. It's about how we incorporate it into the job. So we now have a very bureaucratic process that only 3 people out of our 50,000 employees can approve scope change to one of our big capital projects. So what that means is 90% of our scope changes go away because we've taken that authority away from the frontline managers. And the 10% of changes that we execute have a real business need, and we work with the teams to implement them into the projects.